So I will not take a lot of time because this is a session I'm personally very excited about, and I think it's a very fitting session to have on Netaji's birth anniversary. New India, new normal, a look back to the year that has been, as well as looking forward to the years that are going to be in this new decade for the country. With us, we have Harsh Mander, who's an author, columnist, and social activist. He's also the director of the Center for Equity Studies. And his most recent book, Locking Down the Poor, has been making waves around. Along with him, we have Aakar Patel, senior columnist and former executive director of Amnesty International India. Karuna is E.Parikh, who's a writer and activist, and whose recent book, The Heart Asks Pleasure First, talks about difficult relationships, both with the self and with the other. And this conversation will be moderated by Anjum Katyal, translator, poet, activist, a lot of things, and can't wait for this. So on to you, Ms. Katyal.
Thank you. Thank you for that welcome, and delighted to welcome everybody who's here with us physically, as well as all the people who are joining us online. I know that there are many people watching from all over. Hi, Aakar. Hi, Harsh. Welcome.
Hi.
Welcome. So we're starting this session talking about two words that have been on people's lips a lot this past year, the new normal. We're all supposed to be getting used to the new normal. And we're also apparently going to also have to get used to a quote-unquote new India. So I can't think of three more interesting people to discuss these two concepts with, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I just want to say one thing before we begin, which is, especially when we're talking about something like the new normal, this past year, because I've been involved in arts and culture work for a very long time, there have been a whole lot of discussions around what's going to happen to the arts and culture world, particularly those aspects of which are premised on live presence and live performance. And a lot of the literary festivals were having to rethink and recalibrate and question what their ability and role is going to be going forward, especially when we aren't really out of any serious danger or lockdown as yet. And I'm absolutely delighted that the APJ Kolkata Literary Festival has stuck to its guns and gone on schedule and done everything that was necessary to be done to make this a hybrid festival, which is the term we've all been discussing about how the future is going to go. And also that we've continued to be dedicated to celebrating our heritage, got this wonderful partner with the currency building, bringing heritage sites to life and DAG has been doing tremendous work in this field as well. So I'm generally delighted to be here. And it's great fun to be back in the festival setting, and especially with the start of a new year, which is what AKLF has always tried to do. So having said that, and congratulations to the AKLF team, everybody who's put this all together, I'd like to welcome the panelists today and to ask them, much better qualified to comment on this than I am, what is your idea, when you talk of the new normal, and these are words that have been buzzing around for a while, given the area of interest, expertise, involvement, activism that all of you have been involved in, what do you see as important aspects of the so-called new normal that we're going to have to accept and we're going to have to base our lives on? And I would like to invite Aakar to sort of start off with this. Your book, Aakar, Hindu Rashtra, I've got it right here, and I think all of us have seen this book already, is a really detailed look at some idea of India that seems to be looming, and how did we get here? And the book itself has a lot of information, a lot of research, and a lot of detail on this concept. And maybe, Aakar, you'd like to sort of use that as the springboard, or anything else to talk of new normal?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you to all of you who've come to that festival. I think it's very important that we try and continue as safely as possible our normal lives. I'm delighted also that this is happening in Kolkata, a city I like very much and where my wife is from. My book looks at the manner in which the Indian state, which has sought to be in some ways and pretended to be in some ways pluralist and secular over the last 6 decades, has become quite a different creature over the last few years. I should hasten to add that this is not purely the doing of any one party or any one individual. I think that what has happened over the decades is that fundamental rights that Indians have been given, such as freedom of religion, for instance, freedom of occupation, Article 19, they've been reversed either by political parties in the state legislatures or the courts, or both. But what is new now, is that this is being driven to a large extent top down by the state. We have always had a different sort of government from the rest of South Asia since 1947. The state in India has always claimed to be a pluralist and secular. We have the words actually written in our constitution. But parties have tried always, whether or not society was divided in reality, parties have tried always to hold it together in some sense. I think the newness of what we are looking at now is a government at the center which is popular, but is also extremely divisive. And you could speculate that it's popular because it is divisive. That is what is new. The other thing that occurs to me is that this is happening quite rapidly in a period where society itself is going through all these changes. Mander and I were just speaking a few minutes ago, before we started, of the fact that many of the changes to the state have come in the last 15 months. That a lot of the laws that Indians are on the streets protesting against have come since August last year. You had 3 very large sections of people who have been upset by what the state has done. 2 sets of these people have come to the streets to oppose the laws, and they've managed to push the laws back. A 3rd set can't really come to the streets because they would get shot, and they know it, which is Kashmiris. So to wrap up, we are going through an accelerated phase since the end of 2019, where the state is transforming itself quite openly into a majoritarian, anti-minority sort of government. And we are faced with this normal where the only means of reasonable pushback and engagement we have with the state, which is a protest in public, is denied to us to a large extent because of the circumstances of the pandemic.
Right. Thank you, Aakar. So what you were quite rightly pointing to is what you see as the new normal that's developing very fast, as you said, is an movement away from inclusiveness and pluralism, as you put it, and a movement towards hardening the majoritarian mindset by making the minorities really feel that they are minorities. If I understand you correctly, that's what you were saying. And I'd like to move from here to Karuna. Karuna E.Parikh is, well, I mean, she's a poet, she's a writer, and she's also somebody who's very active on social media, as many of the young people who don't have gray hair like me are. This is her latest book. It's actually her first novel. And what's interesting about this book is it's an unabashed love story. At a time when love, empathy, really feeling for the other has almost turned itself into a political act. That's why I would like you, Karuna, to talk about the fact that you do, in a sense, your book is trying to uphold things that are the opposite of exclusion, and trying to speak up for being able to love across all kinds of borders, borders of religion, borders of country, borders of class even. And we are living in an age where every day in the newspapers there's one more story about love jihad and what's going on. So as a kind of direct reflection or comment on what Aakar just said, how do you feel about what's happening with this new normal?
I think to begin with, this new normal, I think we all agree here that India has not been normal for quite some time already. And you know, what we're calling the new normal is usually in reference to the pandemic. But I think what I saw began just before the pandemic was with the protests, the CAA protests. And like you said, I come from a space of social media, and the space that I mostly occupy in social media is the Instagram space. And what I saw was really fascinating at the time, because Instagram has traditionally, for the last 10 years that I've been on it, has been a space for selfies and holiday images and you know, your pictures of your cappuccino at best. But during the CAA protest time, I started seeing something very fascinating. I started seeing it become very politicized. And we had seen spurts of that, you know, during, say, one rape protest or a little bit for Kashmir. But I had never seen a time before where my entire Instagram feed is filled with people talking about this one thing, with people who have never called themselves political, have never educated themselves on things like this, actually begin to rise up and talk about this. And what I saw right after that was, you know, people started following all kinds of accounts. They started following Pari Network. They started following The Wire. And they started trying to educate themselves and try and understand what was actually going on. So in other words, it began trending. And I found that really interesting. And right after that, we went into lockdown. And while it was heartbreaking to see Shaheen Bagh dispersed, to see things like that, the people who became politicized at that time, the younger people, you don't become unpoliticized or depoliticized after that. And then you have this entire youth population sitting at home with their phones in their hands constantly, access to the internet, not in Kashmir but everywhere else, access to the internet. And they're suddenly reading about Dalit rights. They're suddenly reading about why the CAA was wrong. And I think that is very hopeful for me in this new normal. Not to be blindly optimistic, I think what Aakar was saying is very true, that we definitely are moving at an astonishing speed now towards this majoritarian situation. But I do think there is a flip side to the new normal, and that is this side of hope. I mean, imagine if the CA protest hadn't happened and this kind of activism burst amongst the youth hadn't taken place on social media, we would never have, say, been witness to the migrant worker crisis, because that was not covered in the mainstream media. That was covered on social media. And Twitter is often just lines and noise, but the visual of it was very important. And I do think platforms like Instagram in the new normal have given a face to those who have been faceless for so long, and those who we have liked to ignore for so long. So that's my version of the new normal. And of course, I've dealt with it. It was actually serendipitous that the book came out at the same time, because the book is about a Pakistani Muslim boy and a Hindu Indian girl. And it came out at the time where people were shrieking about love jihad. And I thought to myself, wow, Daya and Aftab, my protagonists, are the perfect case for love jihad. So, that was, it was serendipitous in terms of sales and relatability, but it is heartbreaking for me that a story that I came up with 13 years ago is more relevant today than it was then. So, yeah.
Right. So the new normal, the way you look at it, is the way social media is impacting with it and changing things in a way that makes it new normal, right?
Yeah, mainly because that is the world that I mostly occupy, and that is where I voice my activism most. And where I used to feel very isolated in my activism, I now feel bolstered by those around me, and that's nice to see.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Karuna. I want to ask Harsh now. Harsh's book, the latest book, is Locking Down the Poor. And Harsh's take on what's been going on, how this entire pandemic has shown up a certain huge and very, very severe schism in our society, where some of us are enjoying being at home and having the time to explore different aspects of ourselves, and other people are coping with the fact that all the new rules that are supposed to be the new normal for a lot of people, like social distancing, constant sanitizing, wearing of masks and staying away from everybody else, staying home, these are just not feasible or possible for huge sections of our population. And essentially that's what Harsh has been discussing in the book, how the policies failed and the state failed, and the comfortable classes, as he puts it, were sort of at one end of the spectrum, but the reality for a lot of people was totally different. So Harsh, would you like to briefly talk about how you see this new normal and what you think about it?
Thank you so much, Anjum. My politics is generally known to be based on an almost naive and very stubborn optimism. And yet, the times we are passing through, I think, are the darkest in our republic. And there are two or three very, limited time, and I'd like to talk about two or three different things. One of them, I think we all recognize, which is the normalization of bigotry and hate. And the last year has been significant, but the last 6 decades have been significant because we've had a steady decline. But the first term of the new government, I think there was a political project to render the Indian Muslim politically irrelevant by turning everybody else against them across caste and religion. There was a social project which normalized and even valorized hatred through the project of lynching. And that is what lynching of people by crowds, videotaped, celebrated, protected by the state. And that's why we took out what we call the Karwane-Mohabbat as a response, that you only respond to hate by actually going to every family which has suffered from lynching and saying, there are people who care, we stand with you like you are our own family, we seek forgiveness, we will be with you as you fight for justice. The second term of Mr. Modi, though, I think has seen a massive, this last year that we're talking about, Firstly, it's not now just a social and electoral project. It is a project about changing law and effectively discarding the constitution in multiple ways. And I think that, the love jihad legislation is the most recent, the CAA, the Kashmir, the judgment on the Ram temple. Many of these are, in complete contradiction of what this was. The freedom struggle was about who this country would belong to, what kind of country would it be. And the idea of it being a humane and inclusive country with equal citizenship to people of every faith or the absence of it, of every caste, of every gender, that has been destroyed, and with a brazenness. I think that's one. The second part of the new normal uh, is uh, the the crushing of dissent and the open crushing of dissent. I mean, now the freedom to actually say you disagree. I was part of the anti-CA protest, but I'm being charged with actually being part of a terrorist conspiracy of insurgency and hate mongering, and I can't even believe what I'm supposed to be when I read various charge sheets. And a lot of our young people, some of the most idealistic, and people like Sudha Bhardwaj and others, are in jail for years, primarily because they have dissented. And I think there's a very clear message that to dissent now with the government and its agenda is extremely dangerous, and we will stop at nothing. And the young people who are in jail now in the Delhi riots matter. I mean, the message is that if you're young and you dissent, you've had it. If you're young and Muslim and dissent, then it's even more dangerous. If you're young, Muslim, and a woman, then you've absolutely had it. And I think that message is very clear. There's a chilling impact. The last thing and that's where my book is really about our attitude to the poor. Arundhati Roy somewhere said to us that Karuna was a virus, but it was also an X-ray. It's an X-ray of the kind of society we have. And I think that's really powerful, because the X-ray that I see is that we built and we've been comfortable with a society where some lives have to be protected, and we are being protected. But a lot of lives just don't matter. And so when the Prime Minister announced the lockdown, and he was telling us to stay at home, work from home, keep social distance, and wash our hands, I kept wondering that has he forgotten that the large majority of Indians may not even have a home. If they have a home, it's so small that you cannot, 10 people living in a shanty. People, 9 out of 10 workers are informal workers. They will not get wages. If they don't get wages, they won't be able to eat. They don't have running water. How will they wash their hands? It just seemed, and when the migrants started walking, there was an appeal to charity. That's not what poor people need. They need rights. There are examples in the world. At least if you had a lockdown, you should have given the equivalent of minimum wages to every worker. For instance, you should have, when there were just 500 cases, you should have facilitated people to return home with dignity. But it's very clear, and it's decision after decision, that the lives of the poor don't matter. I've called it, somewhere the banishing of the poor from our conscience and our consciousness, of the middle class and the rich. And I think that's got exposed. So for me, these are the three new normals.
Right. Okay, so a mixture of, as you said, Harsh, you're supposed to be one of the people whose politics is a politics of optimism and hope. And clearly, if you are beginning to sound so grim, then it's a difficult situation that all of us are facing. The other linked idea to this, or concept to this whole thing of new normal, has been, of course, the new India. And we have, in a way, discussed it tangentially. It has come up with all three of you, where you've signposted what looks like the new India is going to be, or it's heading towards. But it would be really interesting that from your particular areas of concern, each of you working in a particular area of which has been deeply part of your lives, if you can talk about a little bit about this whole idea of new India. What is this new India going to be? And shall we keep to the same order, maybe start with Aakar, Karuna, and then you, Harsh. How do you see this new
Thanks.
India, Aakar?
Well, to know what the new India is, I think we ought to juxtapose it with the old India, which sought to differentiate itself from the rest of South Asia by saying it was secular. So, if you're non-Muslim, you cannot hold the office of head of state in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, or the Maldives. The Lankan constitution privileges Buddhism. Bangladesh is possibly as secular as India is in terms of the way it operates, but the constitution opens with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It also claims that it is secular, which is quite so strange. Bhutan is the most theocratic state in South Asia, possibly the world, where one man controls both the faith and the government. In totality. Nepal, I think, is the model that many people in India look at when they say we'll become a Hindu Rashtra. Or Dr. Swami says we are already a Hindu Rashtra. But Nepal was a Hindu Rashtra purely because of the fact that the executive was run by a Kshatriya king who was hereditary, who the constitution said had to be of Aryan descent. And he was guided by Brahmins in his court. It was only Hindu Rashtra to that extent. India doesn't even have that limited model to be able to replicate. We don't have a hereditary king who is Kshatriya. So if not that limited model, what is it that we see the new India and the Hindu Rashtra that we are moving towards? Disappointingly, both for people who support and for those who oppose it, the idea of Hindu Rashtra is what we are living through. And I think that this is also the experience that the other majoritarian states of our neighborhood have had, which is once they have excluded minorities from power, there are no Hindu chief ministers in Pakistan's 4 states. There's no Muslim chief minister in our 28 states. There's no difference between the fact that their constitution might be majoritarian by law while ours is not. The net effect on the ground is the same. It is exclusion. 15 states of India have no Muslim minister at all. 10 states have one minister, usually given minority affairs. So this is exclusion of 20 crore people, the largest minority in the world. Once the state determines that it cannot do for the majority what it seeks to achieve, Pakistan sought to make the country more pious by making sure that the penal code, which they share with us, was changed. And you would have punishments like cutting off of hands for theft, and you would lash people for drinking and so on. That didn't work, and no judge was actually willing to pass those orders. What remained was the exclusion of the minorities, the Ahmadis, the Shia, the Hindu, the Christian in Punjab. What we will have is the same thing. We will have, as we are going through this period and learning, every week some state or the other will pass some law or policy which is aimed at Muslims. Muslim men are the only part of India, the only part of our population to have their divorce law criminalized. If I say the word talaq to my wife 3 times, our marriage does not dissolve and I don't go to jail. If a Muslim man says it to his wife, the marriage does not dissolve because the law says that it is not valid, but he still goes to jail. It's quite unusual. We are picking out things purely to punish. The punishment for cow slaughter in Gujarat is life. The burden of proof is reversed on the person who is actually accused. In 2019, there was a man who was asked to prove that the meat served at his daughter's wedding a few months ago was not beef. When he could not do so to the satisfaction of the court, he was convicted. This is what is meant by persecution, that you rig up the law so that the person, the community you're going after can't really get out of it. We will see more of the same. So we've seen the idea of the love jihad law, which came from the high courts, by the way. Uttarakhand High Court forced almost its legislature to draft this law. The theory, the conspiracy of love jihad began in Kerala High Court. So it's difficult to separate the organs of the state and say this is what balances out the nastiness of one part of the government, because we don't have the ability to self-correct. When the US went to war in Vietnam, or when it went to war in Afghanistan, or it went to war in Iraq, or it had slavery, or it had the Jim Crow laws, you had sufficient pressure internally built up to be able to get it back to the right path. South Asia, generally speaking, and India particularly in this instance, does not have that.
Right.
We tend to reward majoritarianism. We are going through a period in our economic history where today, January of 2021, is the 37th consecutive month of sequential GDP growth decline. This is our fourth year. In 2018, which is the last survey that the government put out, unemployment was at a record high, which was 6.5%. Now it's at about 9%. Government surveys show that Indians were poorer and eating less in 2018 than they were in 2012, 2013. And this was before the lockdown, before the 37 months of decline that I spoke of. So we are going through a period where the electorate is rewarding what would seem to be from the outside to be incompetence on running the majority of what the state should be doing, which is the economy and jobs. But it's quite happy with what is happening on the social side, which is the brutalization of minorities. And I foresee that we will see more of the same.
Thank you, Aakar. Just to add to that, it's not just the religious minorities, is it? It's also Dalits, tribals. There are other kinds of exclusions which have been part of Indian society for a very long time and that are getting exacerbated or strengthened even now, do you think? Yeah, so I mean, it looks like the idea of the majority is also an idea that excludes sections of non-religious minorities.
I would actually agree up to a point, but the thing is that Hindutva is inclusive in many ways. That we've had Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh chiefs who've been primarily Brahmin, but we do have some sentiment from within the RSS that it should be open to non-Brahmins as well. The fact that you have an OBC who's running the nation today from the executive, there is a certain openness both to the Dalit and to the Adivasi. It might not be to the extent that these two groups want, but there is something. Okay. On the other hand, I think what we are doing to Muslims, mostly Christians to some extent, specifically on Article 25, the right to propagate, is deliberate. Okay. There is an act of omission, I think, when it comes to the Dalit or the Adivasi. There is an act of a commission when it comes to the Muslims.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, Karuna, how do you feel about the new India?
Well, this is where my perennial optimism tends to fail me. Because when I look to the near future and the new India that so many seem to celebrate, it does look bleak. The options for the future when it comes to the government are dismal, so to speak. But I will say this, that quite recently I think all of us had a moment of some kind of optimism while watching the US presidential inauguration. And while I don't think there will be an immediate effect in terms of economy or even social impact, I do think there is a certain psychological impact that takes place when you witness something like that. And I do think that there's a huge educated middle class in India that were kind of embarrassed to be, they love the idea of Modi, but when Modi is on the table with, a Trump, that is embarrassing for, I think, many educated middle-class Indians living here, not NRIs. So, I do have some faith in that, let's say, but it is slim faith. And I will say this, that I'm constantly amazed by the fact that Modi has managed to continuously present himself as this, son of the soil who's so for the people, when, as Harsh was saying, there's, it is clearly, this government in particular is so clearly for the rich. And, that the distance between those two things, it amazes me, and it seems so transparent to see that, but clearly it's not for everybody. And to keep people uneducated is completely in their favor. So I would say for the new India that we're looking at, my biggest hopes would be a combination of education and empathy. And I do think that's the only way forward. But yeah, I do have very dark days where I break down, and my husband, who's sitting there, has to kind of see me through that, because I'm so devastated when I think of the future, and the stories of hope are so far and few between sometimes. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's I've been thinking of while we've all been talking is what's currently happening outside Delhi, the farmers' protests, taken over from the CAA, the Shaheen Bagh type protests, which were spreading all over the country. We all had them in every city. And it's not that everybody has stopped being able to get out on the street. That's happening, and obviously is being fueled by a certain degree of belief that something might work. Harsh, coming to you, New India, what do you have to tell us? Sorry, I can't hear you. I think you haven't unmuted yourself.
Okay, so yeah, I hope you can hear me. I said that, I have to begin with a grim picture, but there is a lot of hope, and I would like to underline that as well. The grim side is that, I think of my childhood. I was born 8 years after India got her freedom. We were a partition family, uprooted from Rawalpindi. The whole large part of my extended family has seen a lot of violence and suffering. Yet I do not recall in my entire childhood hearing bigotry and anti-Muslim, talk in my family. I studied in an elite boarding school, Mayo College, etc. I never heard it in school. I never heard it among my friends. I didn't see it in our cinema. We didn't have social media. Bigotry must have been there, of course, but it was just not accepted. I see my 2-year-old grandson and the world India he's growing up in. And everywhere, as soon as he's beginning to understand the world, he's encountering bigotry as normal as heroic. I mean, so in his extended family, when he goes to school, what he watches on television, and sadly, our political leaders, the speeches they gave are so full of bigotry and hatred. What he'll see on social media, what he'll watch on television. So I think that the new India is one in which there is not just a normalization, but a valorization. You're a hero of this nation, of the Hindu nation, by hating Muslims. You're a patriot by hating Pakistan. A young 19-year-old girl went on stage and said, Hindustan Zindabad, Pakistan Zindabad. And she was trying to tell us something. She was saying that, why should I think, wish ill for people of any country, including the people. I'm opposed to the government of Pakistan. I'm not opposed to the people of Pakistan. And they put her into jail under sedition charges because she was trying to give this message. So there's this. The second is that this is in India where we continue, where the middle class, it is among the most uncaring people in the world. And that's what I've tried to argue in my book. This absence of solidarity when we were feeling protected. I was saying that, in Kota, for instance, buses were organized for students to return. And at that time, we had 30 million migrants walking and suffering. I mean, I was saying, could we have had one student in Kota who would say, I refuse to get onto this bus and go home unless you provide similar buses and similar facilities to the poor. But we were comfortable, this total breakdown of solidarity. Once again, if you look at the cinema of the 50s and 60s, they celebrated, they talked about farmers, they talked about rickshaw pullers, they talked about the poor, they talked about the homeless. Today, we have excluded them from our conscience and consciousness, as I said. Right. So that's the second part. But the hope, that, and third is, of course, the fear to dissent. I mean, even 2002, which we thought was a very grim period, when I look back on it, when I decided to leave the IAS, we had the National Human Rights Commission headed by Justice Verma. We had the Supreme Court passing very powerful judgments. We had large segments of the media, including the Times of India, which were reporting and speaking. So all of that has changed, dissent, disagreement with the Hindutva agenda, which is contrary to the constitution. But the hope is the solidarity. And I think the anti-CAA protest, many people say it failed. It didn't fail. It didn't fail at all, because it demonstrated that there were still large numbers of Hindus and other non-Muslims who were willing to stand in solidarity against a law which discriminated against Muslims. And I think that was a very special moment. The Shaheen Bagh, where you had Sikh farmers coming in and saying that we want to give langar to our Shaheen Bagh sisters. We have seen partition in 47. We will not allow it again. And somebody sells his flat so that there's enough money for the langar. On the streets during the lockdown, I was there with my young colleagues, but I saw a large number of people, ordinary people, who went out, who gave food, who gave water, and so on. Those circles of kindness are really important. And the farmers' protest, again, it's not if the law will be taken back, but the fact that they're standing together across Punjab, Haryana, the divide between them has disappeared. Muslims of Malerkotla are there with the Sikhs of Punjab. So I think that it is, if the only way we can fight this battle is by standing together in solidarity. And there's signs that people have understood it. And it is with love and solidarity that we can save this nation from hate. There's no other way.
Right. Thank you, Harsh. That's a good note to start a new year on. And looking forward to, despite all our fears, that there may be something to hold on to for this new India. I think we have reached, I've been getting some fairly explicit signals. So I think we've reached the end of the time allotted to this session. It would have been lovely to have questions, but I don't. Oh, there are 2 questions. Okay, great, let's have them. Where are they?
So both of these questions have come on Facebook. One is, with so much news/opinion created, what is the effect on real issues of new normal? The other one is specifically for Mr. Patel. What needs to be done for the self-correcting mechanism that he was talking about?
Okay, so the first question is, what is the actual impact?
With an excess of information, is the real information getting buried somewhere, and what to do about that?
All right. Who would like to go with that? Harsh, would you like to take that?
Yeah. I think that, a very good example of it was how within 1 week of the lockdown, large majority of Indians, non-Muslim Indians, were persuaded to believe that Muslims were somehow deliberately spreading the virus. And the fact that, the Tablighi Jamaat was picked out and how it was built up into this villain at a time when actually Parliament was also in session, where MLAs were being bought and sold in Madhya Pradesh. There were religious gatherings of Sikhs in Mander, of Hindus in Tirupati. But we picked out one and we persuaded large parts of India to. So I think that it is true with Sushant Singh Rajput, with various others. We are being, we are facing one of the greatest humanitarian crises. I have never seen these levels of hunger and unemployment in urban India, for instance. But these should be our central preoccupations. Everyone's saying that the virus seems to have passed. It's past the middle class. It's reached the very poor. We're not talking about it. So it is true that in this new normal, fake news and news full of hatred and bigotry is pushing out what we should really be concerned about.
Okay, thank you. And the next question was directly to Aakar. Can you just repeat that once?
Well, the thing is that democratic polities are meant to correct themselves internally. So if you have overreach from the executive, you expect that this is corrected either through the voter 5 years hence, or through the polity internally during those 5 years, either through the legislatures or through the judiciary. That doesn't seem to be happening here. What does seem to be happening is what also some parts of the world have seen in terms of correction. The Vietnam War was a nationalist project, and even though tens of thousands of young men came back either dead or wounded, through the Johnson administration, through Nixon, it kept going. What changed, I think, is towards the late 60s, protests from the young, especially in the universities. And I think that though numerically speaking and geographically speaking, these were small, East Coast and West Coast, and a few thousand at the most, they amplified something and made sure that the wider society, particularly the media, became slightly more aligned to the other point of view. In time, and this is not a very long period of time, just a few years, the narrative shifted. I think we are likely to see something similar happen here. If as a citizen in a democratic polity, I have three options of engaging the state. I have the vote, I have the courts, and I have a protest. You know, peaceful assembly is my constitutional right. It's a fundamental right, which enjoys a high degree of protection from the encroachment of the state. It seems that we are using it. The CAA protests, as Harsh Mander says, were actually successful. The laws, the bill became law before the protests started, but the law has still not been put into play. The CAA rules have still not been notified. One reason is that the protests were so effective in mobilizing not just opinion in India, but around the world, to say that India and the state was doing the wrong thing, that the government is now too scared to be able to deploy that law. Similarly, I think what the farmers have done is unprecedented. The democratic space was unable to force a division vote in the Rajya Sabha. The government bulldozed the law nonetheless, but now it cannot actually implement it because of the force of protest. So I'm really optimistic about what has happened in India over the last 14 months and the power of citizens, ordinary citizens, leaderless citizens in large numbers coming out, staying on the street for days to make sure that the state does the right thing. And I think that what we will see is uh, in all of 2021, we will see more of this, where people who have reached the end of their tether have no other option but to vote with their feet, stand up and tell the state to behave. And I'm really proud that we are going through a time when A, the state has misbehaved with its citizens in a way that it never has before. B, that the citizens are pushing back in a way that they never have in the past. And I think that all of us should be grateful for that.
Maybe never since the till the freedom movement. That was another time
I
when we
think,
saw
well,
citizens
yeah,
in the
I
street.
think the numbers would tell you that the freedom movement actually had fewer numbers on the street for shorter periods of time than Shaheen Bagh did or the farmers' protest did. And we would also see, if we read our history slightly more carefully, that actually none of the Congress's great movements worked. The salt satyagraha was phenomenal, but it did not end the salt tax.
Right.
The Shaheen Bagh protest pushed back the law that it cannot actually be put into force. It is more successful than even the salt satyagraha, which we see as being the emblematic protest of the 20th century in our parts.
Right. Thank you. That was interesting. I think we will end now. We've had two questions. I don't think there are any more. I'd like to thank Aakar, Harsh, Karuna for being part of this session and enjoyed it. I hope you have as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.